Hello again, fellow readers. It is I, Mel, your equal opportunity reader, and this is week 2 of our cast read along. Yay. Okay, so let's, I guess, get right into it. Last week, maybe 10 days ago, last week and a half ago, something like that. Last week, anyway, I tried to convince you all to read this book with me because I think it will be excellent and amazing. I read the introduction to you, which was, interestingly enough, I got some interesting messages about this. A lot of people messaged and said things like, yeah, this reminds me of XYZ book about the people who hid Jewish people or the people who fought back during the Nazi period in Germany or, during the Holocaust, people who helped. But yo, I just want to point this out. That's not the point of the introduction at all. The point of the introduction is that most people, whether or not they realize it, are not the kind of people who help. They're the kind of people who follow the status quo until it becomes overwhelmingly obvious it's bad. And sometimes not even, they still keep following even after that. But so just keep that in mind, that the point of that introduction was not, we are all helpers. It was, most of us aren't. Maybe you could be, but you got to pay a little more attention, right? So anyway, cast, week 2. So the first 3 chapters of this book aren't really mind-blowing compared to the way the introduction was. And it's interesting because Isabel Wilkerson is a trained academic. She's a trained historian. She's a very methodical researcher. And it shows because she really takes the time in her books to lay out the foundations of what it is she wants to talk about. I had a similar feeling when I was reading The Warmth of Other Suns. The Warmth of Other Suns is based around actual real life stories of a few people, but it starts with a lot of foundation building. And I think this book is very similar in that because these first 3 chapters are all really unspooling these very elaborate metaphors and these really unique connections between concepts that are really, I think, going to be very important for the rest of the book. But it takes her 3 chapters to lay out, okay, so this is what I mean when I say this, and this is the historical context and the mindset that you need to be in to understand the rest of what it is I'm going to say. So what is it that she actually says? The first chapter is called The Afterlife of Pathogens, and it starts by talking about the resurgence of anthrax, actually, in Siberia. I wanted to say Iceland. That's wrong. Siberia. It starts by talking about the resurgence of anthrax. Because of global warming, you may have heard this before, because of global warming, some places are thawing out. And as they thaw out, there are pathogens in the ice that are now active again, and they've been frozen for however many hundreds, thousands, millions of years. Nobody's had these diseases before, and suddenly people are getting them again. So there's a strain of anthrax that was but people were contracting in Siberia because it defrosted, essentially. It had been dormant for God knows how long, and then it defrosted. And she does this really interesting thing where as she unspools the story of these little boys, I think it begins with, in Siberia, who catch anthrax and nobody knows what it is, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. She draws a comparison between that and the election of Trump. Clever girl. So she talks about how Trump getting elected is kind of like a pathogen defrosting, where, a lot of us, not me necessarily, because, hello, Black person, but a lot of people in America and in the world really kind of looked at America and thought, oh, you elected a Black president. Racism is over. The world has become just. Everything is fair now. And for a variety of reasons, related not only to America, but also to Obama himself, and of course other politicians who came before and after him, presidents who came before and after him, I suppose I should say. That is obviously not true. So she kind of compares this resurgence of white nationalism and violence and division and aggression and certain forms of systematized racism and oppression towards people of color and women and sexual minorities in the US, she likens it to the defrosting of a pathogen. This is something that was frozen and now is defrosting and beginning to affect and even kill people again. Now, I like the comparison. Great metaphor. But I did wonder while I was reading it if it was perhaps a little too simplistic. Because if you think about it, she's basically saying that, the thing with the whole anthrax situation is that that mess was frozen for hundreds of years, if not more. I have to actually look it up, but I'm not going to do that now. That mess was frozen for hundreds of years. People forgot what it was. They didn't know how to recognize the signs. But I think if you are a person of color who lived through the Obama years, if you're a sexual minority, a gender minority, I don't even know if that's the right term. If it's not, I apologize. Please tell me what's correct in the comments. A gender minority or whatever. If you are any kind of not standard person in the US, you know that this never really stopped. If you think it did, what's the coma like, fam? Tell me what it's like. What does it feel like to have woken up after a long coma and not know what was going on while you were sleeping? Because honestly, the number one thing that people I know have said in this era of Trump in terms of the increased violence and increased discrimination and increased oppression and just the increased boldness of people to express stances that support these things is that this never stopped. Trump didn't start something new. He didn't defrost anything. He just legitimized it. And that's where the metaphor holds up. But the idea that this has ever disappeared and been unfamiliar is maybe not Wilkerson's best work. So I was a little bit skeptical about the afterlife of pathogens. I love the way she draws everything together, but I mean, ultimately, I kind of didn't jive with the whole idea that somehow racism has just been bubbling under the surface. No, it's been out in the open the whole time. It's been out in the open. What are we talking about? It never disappeared. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, though, gets quite a bit better. Chapter 2 is called The Vitals of History. And it's an interesting way to look at this because this is where her skills in drawing out extended metaphors to explain concepts that might be fairly complex for a lot of people to grasp really shines. She likens America to an old house that needs constant maintenance. But the problem with this house is that the foundations of it have problems, and unless you want to constantly be doing the same maintenance work year after year, eventually you've got to fix the foundations if you buy an old house. If you fix the underlying work, it means that the maintenance becomes easier on the rest of the house as time goes by. And that, to me, is a brilliant metaphor because I think that there are certain people who think that this call to change America is a call to destroy America. It's not. It's a call to fix the foundations. Now, that means that certain things will have to be destroyed and rebuilt. People keep missing the rebuild part. I don't know anybody personally who's missing the rebuild part, but the idea is not to tear down the house. This is the house we live in. This is the house we love. All our stuff is in this house. But unless we want the house to disappear underneath us one day into a giant sinkhole, we've got to fix the foundations. We've got to shore them up. We've got to knock out the rotten bits and replace them with good, sound materials. And this is a great metaphor. I love how she does this. She really does a good job here. But again, I have a criticism. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful metaphor. Really, really well put together. But again, if you are a person of color, if you are a woman in many cases, if you are a gender minority, if you are a LGBTQIA, if you are disabled, if you are an immigrant, if you are anything but the stereotypical standard, I was born here, I am white, I am a man, American, all of this is obvious. We know there are problems in the inherent building of America. Now, I get that she's not writing just to us. I understand that. She's writing to everybody, and this is in some ways an academic text, which means she had to get past the gatekeepers who are often not us, not yet, but who are not us, right? So I get that. She had to kind of get past the gatekeeper. She had to maybe explain some things in really obvious ways, and I get that, but there are times reading this, I'm like, who are you trying to sell ice to in the wintertime? Obviously, there are problems with the inherent building of America. Now, I will also say that given what's going on right now with Donald Trump, President Trump, given the situation with the current president of the US, openly coming out against, I don't like the term anti racist. I'm not going to use it, just a heads up. I don't like the term anti racist, just like I don't, there's a lot of terms I don't like. We'll get there, I'm sure. But he's kind of come out openly against the idea of teaching actual American history. He's very much in the he wants to kind of keep the American mythological canon alive in terms of Columbus was a great man, the founding fathers were Christians, and there's no discrimination anymore because Obama was president and now I am. That's kind of his platform in terms of American education and history, and also in terms of diversity education. And he keeps calling, I don't know if you saw the last two debates. I filmed the first video, by the way, before any of the debates happened. So I was kind of a little bit behind then. I'm trying to get this one out the day after I film it. So hopefully nothing major will happen in between now and then, please, God. Anyway, so yeah, he keeps calling the idea of diversity education, the idea of learning the true people's history of the United States, as maybe Howard Zinn would call it, learning that history. He keeps calling it a myth. He keeps calling it false. He keeps calling it some sort of like, how did he put it? I don't even care. I don't care how he put it. The point is, he doesn't want to teach the entire history of America. He wants to teach a very narrow, myopic, that's the word. A very narrow and very myopic kind of version of America that shores up the myth that America is fine the way it is. But in the meantime, the rest of us can see that our foundation has termites, and there's mold in the basement, and also, insurance isn't going to cover any of it, right? So I guess my point is that while I read much of chapter 2 thinking, obviously, I think there are people who might pick up this book out of genuine curiosity, or there are people who could stand to read this book, jury's on whether or not they will, who would maybe be under the impression that America as a house has beautiful foundations, beautiful furniture, and beautiful paint. Whereas we all know that the paint is peeling, the furniture is old, and the foundations are crumbling, and we got to get all that fixed if we intend to have a house 150 years from now, for our children and children's children. Okay, so that said, the metaphor itself, again, is beautiful, really wonderfully rendered. Isabel Wilkerson is such a talented writer and such a methodical researcher. And when those two things melt together, it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Because it kind of heads off at the pass, the thinking that, oh, well, there's no inequality in America anymore. Or if there's inequality in America, it's not our fault. We have to just move past it. You can't just move past rotten foundations or holes in the roof, can you? If it was a house, you'd fix your foundations, you'd fix your roof, you'd clean your basement. But if America is an old house, many Americans are taking the approach of just sort of letting the walls rot away while they sit in the kitchen thinking, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing. Look, I'm cooking. Nothing's burning down. It's fine. Right. So I really love the way she puts that metaphor together. It's very useful, I think, and very, very appropriate. It's a much better metaphor than the pathogens one from the previous chapter. Now, chapter 3, though, is my favorite chapter out of the ones that there should be a we now. Tell me, are you reading with me? Please read with me. Okay. So chapter 3 is my favorite chapter out of the chapters that we read together, hopefully, because I was very interested as to whether or not she did the work on the actual topic caste. The word caste, C-A-S-T-E, comes from India, actually. So it's the whole idea of the Indian caste system that she's kind of cribbing from for her concept, for the concept in this book. I'm just looking for the chapter here now. So she's scribbling from that concept, and I kind of wondered if she would go back and attribute it correctly, and she does so, but in a really interesting way. Again, Wilkerson is a great academic, a great researcher, a very methodical, very meticulous writer, but she's also an excellent storyteller. And chapter 3 opens with the story of what happened when Martin Luther King Jr. went to India in 1959. It's the story of when Martin Luther King Jr. went to India in 1959 and was shocked to find that when he was speaking in front of these Indian luminaries who had brought him there to talk about the American Civil Rights Movement, he was being introduced as an American untouchable. For those of you who don't know, untouchable at the time, the preferred term now is Dalit, I believe. But at the time, untouchable was the lowest caste of Indian society. People who basically cleaned toilets or things like that. People who had no status at all in society. Martin Luther King goes to India, and when he gets up to give his speech, he's introduced as an American untouchable. And she quotes him. He says he's shocked. He was hurt. I'm not what? I'm an American, right? Is kind of his response. But he finds, he thought it through because he was Martin Luther King Jr. and therefore brilliant. He thought it through and thought, yeah, actually, that is what it is. So what I got from this chapter is that there is actually historical and academic and social social precedent. That's the word. Social precedent for comparing the system of racial hierarchy in America to the caste system in India. This has been happening since the 1950s. People have been drawing these comparisons. And Wilkerson actually talks about how she does some traveling to India. She did some traveling. She went there and she interacted with a lot of people who are doing social justice work and activism work in creating greater equality, greater equity in India. Equity is a better word than equality, isn't it? We'll talk about that more later, I'm sure, as we read. So she wanted to talk to people who were actually doing the work on the ground in India in terms of creating greater equity in India. And she did, and she felt really embraced by them. And she also notices there's a lot of really interesting things in this chapter. I'll just say go through and read it because she points out some things that I have always thought of as endemic to American society because I'm an American. I was raised there. And even though I haven't lived there in a lot of years, over a decade now, there are times when I do fall into that kind of American exceptionalist trap that I was raised in, including the exceptionalist thinking that even our racism is exceptional. And in some ways, it is. I mean, that's not mince words. But there's a lot of times we don't realize how intertwined many social justice and equality movements are across the world, as how many racial justice movements and class justice movements, how these are often connected, and they have been throughout history, but we never talk about the connections. We often tend to talk about it as though we are the only people who are oppressed, or they are the only people who are oppressed, or we play these oppression Olympics games with each other. These people had it worse than these people, when really it's all bad and you can't really compare, but at the same time, what comparing is falling into the trap of the oppressors because that's what they do. Instead, we should be working together and eradicating this BS, which is something that, again, I really love how Wilkerson draws up the historical precedents for that. How Indian activists were connected to early American civil rights movements. And I mean, I think at this point, it's pretty common knowledge that Gandhi was a big inspiration for Martin Luther King Jr., even though Gandhi turned out to be a bit of a racist and an anti-Black racist at that himself after having lived in South Africa and so on. That's another story for another day, and it's not addressed in this book. But there is a story of a gentleman who came and studied in, he was technically part of the Dalit caste. He came and studied in America, and then he went back to India, and even though he never really discussed his time in America very much, he did go back and become a huge activist, and he was in America during the civil rights movement. There's actually quite a lot of interplay, interconnection, intermovement. That's the word I'm looking for. Intermovement between Black America and lower caste, middle caste Indian people that I was not aware of. And she talks about that quite a lot in chapter 3. And she also talks about how that connection is still a thing in some ways, because she goes to India and she's given a bust of the gentleman I mentioned before, who was a major activist in eradicating oppression and systematic inequities against Dalit people, and they give her a bust of his face. And when she brings it back through the airport, it gets flagged by security because it's a big metal thing in her bag. And she's trying to explain to the young Black TSA worker what it is, and she doesn't have time to explain, well, this is really the history of this guy from India who actually, she doesn't have time for all of that. So she just says, it's the Indian Martin Luther King, which is a great end to the chapter and a great cap, I think, to what we're talking about today, because I just finished reading Angela Y. Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And there's a point that she makes over and over and over again in that book, which is that activism is about interconnectedness. If you're going to take a feminist approach to work, which I balk a bit at the words feminist approach, because what that means in pop culture and what that means in practice and reality are often two very different things. But the way that she uses it is in a practical and orthopraxic kind of way. She uses it in a way that means doing things, not just saying things or believing things performatively. So the idea is that feminine work in social justice is often focused on creating connections to people, on creating communities. And in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, she brings up the point constantly that the work of women and people who are feminists in these works has been to create connections between movements that don't seem as though they have any connection, such as Palestine liberation and Black Lives Matter, huge connections, such as Maori youth in New Zealand and Black Lives Matter. Again, doesn't seem to have a connection, but it does. Such as Dalits in India and Black Americans in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Again, you wouldn't necessarily draw an immediate connection. And we are not taught about these connections, because I think if we were, we would have a more global sense of the world. And I feel like that is something that people in power actively work against. It's much easier to exploit people when they feel alone and when they feel that their goal is to create a connection to oppression and not to community. That's just my take on it. Now, I don't know how Isabel Wilkerson identifies politically or socially. I don't know if she considers herself a feminist. I don't know if I consider myself a feminist, because the pop culture term of the word is really obnoxious and it drives me nuts. I'm much more interested in womanism than I am in feminism, but that's a discussion for another day, not today. And it always has been like that way for me. I mean, if it doesn't matter either way. But at least not now, it doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about. But that point that Angela Y. Davis makes about kind of creating connection and community between social justice movements, between equity movements, between groups of people who are not treated fairly, and how that creates power for us all and how that creates equity for us all, just the knowledge that we exist and we're all having similar struggles in different places is amazing. And I love that she pulls that out at the end of chapter 3. And it makes me look forward to what's coming next, even though I already kind of know what's coming next. I'm trying to get you excited about this because I want you to read the book with me. So I'll stop there. Yeah. What did you think about this? Are you reading the book? If you're not reading the book, why? Read with me. I'm lonely. No, anyway. My question is, are you reading the book? I hope you are. If you are reading the book, what do you think about it so far? Is it interesting? Has anything really stood out to you? Tell me what you think. Tell me more. Tell me more. I'll be back next week. And for next week, I'm going to read the last chapter in part 1, which is called An Invisible Program. And I'm also going to try and read all of part 2 because, actually, I take that back. Part 2 is like 20 chapters long. Forget that. No, it's 5 chapters long, but still. So I'm going to read up through chapter 6. So chapter 6 is called The Measure of Humanity. That's where I'm going to stop my reading for next week. I'll be back next week with some discussion for you, hopefully a little less disjointed than this one was. But yeah, see you then. Peace, beautiful readers. Bye.